Hello, my name is Anthony Bennett. I'm 33 years old, an architect, and if you looked at my life from the outside, you might think I've achieved everything I wanted: a stable job, a comfortable house in a quiet suburb, and designs that clients highly praise. But if you asked me how I truly feel, I'd tell you there's an emptiness inside me, a hidden wound I've carried for a long time, ever since I was a child, when I learned to stand on my own in a family that never saw me as enough. I grew up in a home where appearances were always the priority. My parents, who meticulously curated their outward image, from the way they dressed to the way they spoke, wanted everything to seem perfect in the eyes of others. They wanted the neighbors to marvel, friends to gush over a happy and successful family. But behind that facade, my younger brother Rowan and I grew up in two entirely different worlds. Rowan, 3 years my junior, was the center of all attention. From a young age, he was coddled like a precious gem. I still vividly remember the day Rowan started first grade. My mother bought him a brand new, shiny, expensive outfit so costly I couldn't even fathom it. Meanwhile, I wore hand-me-downs from the previous year, patched and worn, because my mother said, "You're older, you can manage." When Rowan turned 18, my parents gifted him a car, a flashy red convertible, the kind any kid would dream of. I can still see the sparkle in Rowan's eyes as he sat in the driver's seat. Meanwhile, at 21, I was still taking the bus to college, lugging books I'd bought with money from my part-time job. Don't get me wrong, I don't resent Rowan, or at least I've tried not to feel that way. But the feeling of being overlooked, of being treated as an afterthought in my own family, was like a tiny needle piercing my heart day after day. When we were both in college, the disparity became even starker. My parents happily paid for Rowan's entire tuition, from school fees to rent for an apartment near campus so he could focus on his studies. And me? I worked while studying, waiting tables, delivering packages on weekends, and sometimes surviving on 3 hours of sleep to finish assignments. I never complained because I knew if I didn't push myself, no one would be there to lift me up. That harsh environment shaped me. I learned to be independent, to grit my teeth through the toughest days. I remember once, while working at a construction site to earn extra money, I fell from some scaffolding. Luckily, I only got scrapes. When I called home, my voice trembling as I told my mother, she barely acknowledged it, quickly shifting to ask about Rowan. Had he eaten dinner? Did he need more pocket money? I grew used to moments like that, but each time it felt like my heart was being squeezed. I never said it out loud, but deep down I've always longed for something simple. For my parents to look at me, truly see me, and say they were proud. Just once I wanted to hear that I was enough, that my efforts mattered. But that moment never came. Still, I didn't let those wounds hold me back. After graduating college, I threw myself into work like a moth to a flame. I worked day and night, taking on every project I could, from small apartment sketches to larger constructions. I saved every penny, never spending recklessly, because I had a dream: to own a home of my own. Not to show off, not to prove anything to anyone, but to have a place I could call mine, a place where I could breathe without feeling suffocated. When I was 30, I achieved that dream. I bought a house in the suburbs, not extravagant but comfortable, with large glass windows overlooking a small garden. I personally designed every corner, from the layout of the living room to the smallest details on the walls. Every brick, every frame was the result of my sweat and effort. The day I moved in, I stood in the living room watching sunlight pour through the windows, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. This house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything I'd accomplished despite it all. I still try to fulfill my duties to my parents. I make sure to support them financially and visit every month. But each time I see them, their eyes are fixed on Rowan, the son they've always seen as their pride and joy, even though he's done little besides spend money and stir up trouble. Rowan, now 30, still lives like a spoiled child. He's chronically unemployed, spends money like water, and I've heard rumors that he's tangled in some unclear debts. Yet my parents defend him, calling him their poor child who needs protection. To them, I'm just the successful older brother, expected to shoulder every responsibility. I don't know if there's ever been a moment in my life when I truly felt I belonged to that family. Some days I wonder, if I didn't have money or success, would my parents even remember me? Would they ever think about the nights I stayed up studying, the days I worked myself to exhaustion to get where I am? The answer, I fear, is no. But I keep going. I stand tall, not for them, but for myself. I've built a life, a career, a home, all with my own hands. And though my heart still carries those scars, I believe I can overcome them. I don't need anyone's validation to know my worth. But deep down, I still long for something I may never have. A real family, where I'm not just the one who sacrifices, but the one who is loved. Ever since I started earning a stable income, I've been fulfilling my filial duties to my parents. I send them money every month, pay for their utilities, fix the roof when it leaks, and even bought an air purifier for my mother because she said her lungs were weak. I do all these things not because I expect gratitude, but because I believe it's my duty as a son. But not once, not a single time, have my parents said thank you. They accept the money, the gifts, the help, as if it's only natural. I still remember the look in my father's eyes when I handed him a check to renovate the family's old run-down kitchen. He took it, nodded, and then turned to ask Rowan how he was doing. My mother, meanwhile, never stopped talking about Rowan's struggles, how he was going through tough times and needed help. I sat there, listening, but said nothing. I learned long ago to stay silent because speaking up only makes things worse. Until one afternoon, everything began to change. My phone rang while I was sitting in my office staring at an unfinished design. My mother's number flashed on the screen and I felt an uneasy premonition. She rarely called at this hour unless something serious was happening. I answered and her voice on the other end trembled, not with emotion but with worry. "Anthony, come home for dinner tonight. We need to talk." I asked what it was about, but she only repeated, "Just come home, son. It's important. It's not something to discuss over the phone." Then she hung up. After work, I drove to my parents' house, my mind filled with unease. The old family home was the same as ever, with its white painted fence now faded, and the small garden my mother meticulously tended. As I stepped inside, the familiar smell of my mother's beef stew filled the air. My father sat at the head of the table, quietly reading the newspaper while my mother bustled in the kitchen. The atmosphere seemed normal, but I knew all too well that beneath this calm a storm was always brewing. Dinner began in silence. I sat across from my father, my mother beside me, and Rowan was absent. I asked, "Where's Rowan?" My mother stopped chewing, set her chopsticks down, and exchanged a glance with my father. "He's busy," my father said, his voice low but sharp, as if holding back something. I didn't press further, knowing the real answer would soon come to light. After a few minutes, my mother spoke, her voice soft but heavy with pressure. "Anthony, our family is in trouble." I stopped eating, looked at her, and waited. She took a deep breath and continued. "Rowan, he's unemployed, and he's gotten himself into debt. Loan sharks have been coming to the house threatening us. They banged on our door in the middle of the night looking for him. Not only that, they know our address and keep calling, demanding money. We're scared." Her voice trembled, and I saw her eyes well up with tears. My father sat silently, but his hands gripped the newspaper so tightly it crumpled. I felt a rush of heat to my head. Rowan, always Rowan. I wasn't surprised, but anger surged within me like a wave. "How much does he owe?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mother hesitated, then said a number that stunned me. $50,000. A significant sum, especially for someone unemployed like Rowan. He borrowed money to start a business, but it failed. She sighed, her voice tinged with an attempt to justify him. He promised to pay it back gradually, but now he's broke and the creditors won't let it go. I looked at my father, hoping he'd say something, anything, to reassure my mother or at least show some fairness. But he just stared at me, his gaze commanding. "You're his older brother, Anthony. You have to help him." His tone left no room for negotiation. I felt a weight settle on my chest, as if someone had placed a boulder there. "How do you want me to help?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My mother jumped in, her voice urgent. Pay off Rowan's debt. Just this once, to save him, to save our family. And starting next week, let Rowan move in with you. He needs a stable environment to start over. Your house is spacious, you're successful. It wouldn't be hard to have him stay with you, right? I sat there, still holding my chopsticks, but my mind went blank. Pay off Rowan's debt? $50,000, money I'd have to work tirelessly for months to earn. And let him move into my house? The house I poured my sweat and tears into building, the only place where I feel safe. Now they wanted me to share it with someone who's never valued anything? I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. I love my parents, I truly do. I don't want them living in fear with debt collectors pounding on their door at midnight. I knew if I didn't help, those gangsters wouldn't let up. But let Rowan live with me? No, that was something I couldn't accept. I'd seen Rowan squander money, shirk every responsibility, and I knew if I let him into my world, he'd destroy it all. I'll pay off Rowan's debt, I said, my voice slow but resolute. My mother let out a sigh of relief, her eyes lighting up as if a burden had been lifted. But I wasn't finished. But I won't agree to let Rowan move into my house. He has to take responsibility for his own life. I'm not his guardian. The room fell deathly silent. My father slammed the newspaper down, his eyes sharp as knives. What did you say? He asked, his voice so low it sent a chill down my spine. My mother grabbed my hand, her voice trembling. Anthony, you're his brother. You can't abandon him like this. He needs you. But I shook my head, my voice still calm, though my heart pounded. I've done enough. I'll pay the debt to protect you both, but Rowan has to stand on his own. I can't live his life for him. My father stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. Who do you think you are to talk like that? He shouted. You have a house, money, everything, while your brother has nothing. Are you so selfish you can't lift a hand to help? I felt the blood rush to my face, but I didn't back down. I'm not selfish, I said, my voice starting to tremble. I just want to protect what I've built. Rowan isn't a child. He's 30 years old. He needs to be independent. My mother began to cry, her soft sobs piercing my heart. But I knew if I gave in now, I'd lose myself. I'm sorry, I said, standing up, but I won't change my decision. I walked out of the room, leaving behind my father's furious glare and my mother's tears. As I closed the door, I heard my father mutter, "Ungrateful child." I drove home in the dark, my mind reeling. I agreed to pay off Rowan's debt, not for him, but for my parents. But refusing to let him move into my house was my final boundary. I knew from this moment on things would never be the same. The days that followed passed in heavy silence. My parents didn't call and I didn't reach out either. I buried myself in work, architectural drafts, client meetings, as a way to drown out the storm brewing in my family. But I knew it was only a temporary calm before everything erupted. And then Thanksgiving arrived, like a loaded bullet, ready to fire straight into my heart. Thanksgiving was always a time for our family to gather. My parents' house was decorated vibrantly, with twinkling lights strung outside the door and the mouth-watering aroma of roasted turkey wafting from the kitchen. I arrived early carrying a bottle of red wine, my mother's favorite, though she'd never thanked me for it. As I stepped inside, the air buzzed with the chatter and laughter of relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant family members I saw only once a year were all there. The long dining table was draped with a pristine white cloth, laden with traditional dishes. Golden roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, sweet pumpkin pie, and plates of meticulously prepared vegetables. This was supposed to be a warm, cozy evening where everyone shared joy and gratitude. But I was mistaken. I sat down trying to blend into the atmosphere, chatting with Uncle Henry about my latest construction project. But my parents' gazes from the head of the table cut through me, cold and judgmental. Rowan was there too, sitting across from me, wearing an expensive dress shirt I'd bet my parents bought him. He laughed and joked with Aunt Susan as if he weren't drowning in debt. Dinner began, and for the first few minutes things seemed fine. But then, as if following a scripted play, my mother spoke, her voice soft but loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Anthony, have you reconsidered Rowan's situation?" Her question was like a stone thrown into a still lake, drawing every eye to me. I gripped my knife and fork tightly, trying to stay calm. "What situation, Mom?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. She sighed, her eyes full of disappointment. "About letting Rowan live with you. He's struggling and you're his older brother. You should help him." Her voice trembled as if I were the one who'd pushed Rowan into ruin. I looked at my father, who nodded in agreement. "You have everything, Anthony. What's so hard about sharing a little with your brother? You're not much of a brother if you cling so tightly to what's yours." I felt heat rising to my face. The air around the table grew stifling, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out. The aunts and uncles stopped talking. The cousins stopped giggling. Every eye was on me, waiting for my response. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I've already paid off Rowan's debt, as you both know. I did that so you wouldn't be harassed. But letting him move into my house? I can't do that. He needs to take responsibility for his own life." My mother burst into tears, tears streaming down her cheeks. "All you care about is money. Do you even think about family? Rowan is your brother, your flesh and blood." Her voice broke, and I noticed some relatives shaking their heads, whispering. Aunt Susan, who always defended Rowan, chimed in. "Brothers should support each other, Anthony. Helping your brother a little isn't too much to ask, is it?" I felt like my chest was being crushed. I wanted to scream, to tell them all about the years I worked tirelessly, the sleepless nights, the times I gritted my teeth to push through alone. But I knew it would be pointless. In their eyes, I was the successful one, the one who had everything, so I was expected to sacrifice. It was an unquestionable duty. I felt cornered in the very house where I was born and raised. Then my father, who had been sitting silently with a cold expression, suddenly spoke, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Anthony, who do you think you are to refuse to help your brother?" He slammed his knife and fork onto the table, the clink of metal against porcelain ringing like a warning. "You have a house, money, everything, and you won't open your door to Rowan. Do you want the whole world to look at this family and laugh? Do you want your parents to live in shame because you're too selfish?" I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my voice trembling but resolute. "You're a father who only covers up for a spoiled son's mistakes. Have you ever considered my efforts, my sacrifices? I've done everything for this family, but I've never gotten a single word of recognition. I'm exhausted." The table fell deathly silent. The clinking of cutlery stopped. The relatives' whispers ceased. My mother stared at me, eyes wide, as if I'd said something horrific. My father shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he roared, his voice echoing through the room. Before I could react, he raised his hand and a slap landed hard across my face. It stung. The slap burned my cheek, but the pain in my heart was 1,000 times worse. I stood there, frozen, my hand still gripping the edge of the table. I looked into my father's eyes, hoping to see a trace of regret, but all I saw was anger and disappointment. My mother covered her face, sobbing, but she said nothing to defend me. And Rowan, the brother I'd paid debts for, sacrificed for, stood with his arms crossed in the corner, a smirk curling his lips. "Rich, but too stingy to share a house," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're the most selfish person I know." His words were like a knife tearing through the last shred of faith I had left. I looked around the table at the faces of relatives I once thought of as family. Not one spoke up for me. In their eyes, I wasn't Anthony, the man who rose from nothing with his own hands. I was just the older brother who had to sacrifice, who had to carry the burden because I had everything. In that moment, I understood a painful truth. I was alone. Not just my parents, not just Rowan, but the entire family had turned their backs on me. They were willing to trample me to protect Rowan, regardless of right or wrong. My father's slap didn't just hurt my face. It shattered the last illusions I'd clung to about family. I said nothing more. I walked out of the room, leaving behind my mother's sobs, the relatives' whispers, and Rowan's scornful smirk. As I got into my car, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel, I felt like my entire world had collapsed. But at the same time, a small flame began to burn inside me, a flame of resolve. The days following Thanksgiving passed in heavy silence. I tried to return to my daily routine, burying myself in work as a way to forget the wounds still bleeding in my heart. But every time I stepped into my house, a vague sense of unease washed over me. The house, once my sanctuary, the fruit of years of relentless effort, now felt like a fortress under threat. I knew my decision to refuse Rowan's move-in had ignited a storm, and I was right. One late night after an exhausting day of work, I drove home, my mind weary but forcing itself to stay alert. The suburban streets were eerily quiet, with only the sound of my tires rolling on the pavement and the dim glow of streetlights casting shadows on the swaying poplar trees, their leaves rustling in the cold wind. As I turned onto the road leading to my house, a bad feeling surged within me, making my heart pound. Something was wrong. I could sense it, though I didn't know exactly what. I slowed down, letting my headlights sweep across the small garden in front of my house, then stopped at the porch. And then I froze. The large glass window in the living room, the one I'd once been so proud of for catching the morning light, was shattered. Shards of glass littered the porch, glinting under the headlights like sharp blades. I turned off the engine but didn't dare open the car door right away. My breathing quickened and a chill ran down my spine. This was no accident. I stepped out of the car, turned on my phone's flashlight, and moved toward the house, my feet heavy. The crunch of broken glass under my shoes echoed in the silent night like a haunting melody. As I approached the porch, the beam from my phone illuminated the outer wall, and I nearly stopped breathing. Jagged, angry streaks of red spray paint covered the white wall. Threatening words scrawled in crooked letters glared back at me. "You'll regret this, and don't test me." I stood there, my eyes fixed on the words, trying to stay calm. But then another detail caught my attention. The wooden front door was still closed, but deep scratches marred its surface, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a sharp object. I stepped back, scanning the garden, and my flashlight beam landed on the metal mailbox in the corner of the yard. It was always securely shut, but now its lid hung open, dangling loosely. I approached, my hand trembling as I touched the lid. Inside, the mailbox was stuffed with trash, stinking beer cans, half-burned cigarettes, and at the bottom a carefully folded piece of paper. I picked up the paper, unfolding it with shaking fingers. The handwritten note, scrawled with malicious intent, hit me like a punch. "You'll pay for this." No signature, no clue, nothing but the stark reality of my violated home. The neighbors, who usually greeted me warmly each morning, now stood at a distance, whispering among themselves. Mrs. Miller, who lived across the street, peeked out from her window, but when I looked her way, she quickly drew the curtains. No one came to check on me. No one dared to get involved. I felt like I was standing alone on the edge between safety and danger, with no one willing to step to my side. I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I described the incident. 2 officers arrived, took cursory notes, snapped a few photos, and asked if I'd made enemies with anyone. I racked my brain but couldn't recall any conflicts. In the end, I shook my head. The older officer sighed, saying that without security cameras or witnesses, there was little they could do. "Call us if you find anything new," he said, and they left, leaving me standing amid the broken glass and threatening words. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the sofa, my eyes glued to the front door as if danger might burst through at any moment. Around 2 in the morning, my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered, but all I heard was heavy breathing, followed by a low, raspy voice. "You think you can escape? Just wait." The call ended before I could respond. My heart pounded, and I knew this was no prank. It was an anonymous call, a message meant to instill fear. A name flashed in my mind, Rowan. I thought of his smug smirk at Thanksgiving, the only person with a motive and enough resentment to orchestrate these threats. The next morning, without hesitation, I called Rowan. I couldn't hold back my anger any longer. When he answered, his voice was calm, as if nothing had happened. "Did you hire someone to vandalize my house?" I shouted, my voice trembling with rage. "Don't think I don't know about your dirty tricks." He was silent for a moment, then let out that familiar mocking laugh. "You're crazy," he said. "Your house got trashed, and that's got nothing to do with me. You can't just pin the blame on me like that. You're such a failure." I wanted to scream into the phone to force him to confess, but I knew it was pointless. Rowan was always skilled at turning the tables, and this time was no different. Just a few hours after our call, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Her voice was filled with outrage, almost shouting through the phone. "Anthony, how dare you accuse Rowan like that? He's already suffering, and you're trying to smear him to tarnish our family's honor. You're heartless." I tried to explain, to tell her about the shattered window, the threatening messages, but she wouldn't listen. "Deal with your own problems," she said. "Don't drag Rowan into this." Then she hung up. I sat there, still holding the phone, overwhelmed by a wave of isolation. My father called right after, his voice cold as ice. "You've disappointed me, Anthony. Rowan's trying to rebuild his life, and you're making up stories to humiliate him. You're not worthy of being my son." His words were another knife plunging deep into my heart. I wanted to shout that I was the one under attack, the one living in fear, but I knew that to my parents, Rowan would always be the victim, and I was just the one who had to endure. Rowan, I knew, was furious with me. My refusal to let him move in had made me his enemy. I could picture his scornful smirk, the way he stood with his arms crossed as my father slapped me at Thanksgiving. He didn't just want me to give in, he wanted me to crumble. And now, with the shattered window, the threatening messages, and the anonymous calls, I knew he wouldn't stop. The days after the vandalism passed in a haze, as if I were a ghost in my own life. Every night I checked the front door 3 times, drew the curtains tight, but the fear clung to me like a shadow. Every small noise outside, a snapping twig, a passing car, made my heart leap. I tried to focus on work, but the architectural drafts, once my passion, now felt like meaningless scribbles on paper. I stared at the living room wall where a piece of cardboard temporarily covered the shattered window and asked myself, what am I protecting? This house, or my own dignity? The more I thought, the more I realized that the house, my lifelong symbol of effort, was no longer a haven. It had become a battlefield where I faced hostility from my own family. In my despair, I thought of my grandfather, Harrison Bennett. He was the only person in the family I truly respected, though he lived apart, rarely joining family gatherings. My grandfather lived in a small villa in a distant suburb where time seemed to slow, with tree-lined roads and birdsong greeting each morning. He was stern, reserved, but every word he spoke cut sharp, as if he could see through everything. I remembered my childhood visits to him, sneaking away to listen as he sat in his old armchair, telling me stories of the buildings he constructed in his youth and how a man must stand firm against life's storms. "True strength," he once said, "lies not in what you possess, but in what you're willing to let go." I didn't hesitate. I decided to drive to my grandfather's house one late afternoon as the sunset bathed the hills in gold. His villa nestled beside a small stream, its stone walls covered in moss and its garden bursting with wildflowers. When I knocked, he opened the door, his sharp yet gentle eyes meeting mine. "Anthony," he said, his voice warm but steady, "come in." Without asking, he seemed to know I was there for a serious reason. Inside, his home was simple yet cozy, with a crackling fireplace and the faint scent of aged wood. We sat across from each other in the living room before an oak table he'd built himself years ago. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in my life, I shed the armor of strength I'd worn for years. I poured out everything, from the years I worked tirelessly to put myself through college, to my parents' favoritism toward Rowan, to the slap at Thanksgiving, and finally the vandalism of my home. I told him about the threatening messages scrawled on my wall, the note in the mailbox, the anonymous calls that kept me from sleeping. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "I don't know what to do anymore, Grandpa," I said, staring down at my clenched hands. "I've tried to do everything right, but they just want me to break." My grandfather listened without interrupting. His eyes were piercing yet compassionate, as if he could see straight into my soul. When I finished, he sat in silence for a moment, stroking his silver beard. Then he spoke, his voice low but unwavering like a lighthouse in a storm. "Anthony, you've done more than your duty. You've sacrificed more than they deserve. But as long as you cling to that house, you're only making yourself a target for them to keep trampling. If you want to truly break free, let it go." I froze. The house, the one I'd saved for years to buy, designed down to every brick, was my symbol of freedom. Let it go? It felt like he was asking me to erase myself. But he continued, his gaze softening like a father guiding a lost son. "A house doesn't define your worth, Anthony. You do. That house, no matter how much you love it, has become a trap. Sell it, come live with me. Here, you'll be safe. And more importantly, you'll have time to see the path ahead clearly." His words were like a cold wind, blowing through my mind and clearing the fog of despair. I sat there staring at the flickering fireplace, the dancing flames reminding me of the resolve burning within me. My grandfather was right. The house, though precious, was just a material thing. It couldn't shield me from the wounds my family had inflicted. And if I kept clinging to it, I'd remain a target for Rowan's resentment, my parents' demands, and my relatives' indifference. I took action the next morning. I contacted a real estate agency asking them to appraise and list my house for sale. I canceled all the automatic payments I'd quietly made for my parents over the years: electricity, water, home repairs. Things they'd never thanked me for. It hurt a little to hit the cancel button, but at the same time I felt a surge of freedom. I was no longer the family's living ATM. I packed my belongings, taking only the essentials: a few clothes, my laptop, and a small wooden box containing my earliest architectural sketches. I looked at the house one last time, the morning sunlight still trying to filter through the cardboard covering the broken window as if pleading with me to stay. But I'd made my decision. I drove to my grandfather's villa carrying light luggage but a heart full of hope. There, in that peaceful home by the stream, I would start anew. No more of my parents' expectations, no more of Rowan's burdens. For the first time in my life, I dared to choose my own path, not for my family, but for myself. But I knew this peace was only temporary. The decision to sell my house and cancel the automatic payments to my parents was a clear declaration. I was no longer the son, the brother they could exploit. I had braced myself for my family's reaction, yet when it came, it hit harder than I had imagined. Just a few days after I signed the contract to sell the house, my phone began ringing incessantly. First my mother's number, then my father's, then unfamiliar ones I guessed belonged to relatives. I watched the screen light up again and again, Mom flashing like a reminder of all those years I had tried to fulfill my duty. But I didn't answer. Each ring felt like a hammer striking my chest, yet I told myself I no longer owed them any explanation. I let the phone buzz until it went silent, only to ring again like an endless refrain. My email inbox was no sanctuary either. Lines from my mother started flooding in, each message like an arrow aimed straight at my heart. "Anthony, you cannot abandon your aging parents like this," one email read. "And what about Rowan? What about family? Have you forgotten what blood ties mean?" I read them, and each word cut into memories of all the times I had quietly sent money home, repaired their house, without a single word of thanks. But it was my father's final email that left me frozen. "If you insist on being so stubborn, then from now on don't call yourself a son of this family anymore," he wrote. His words cold and sharp, like a slap across the face on Thanksgiving night. I sat in silence for long minutes, eyes fixed on the screen, my chest tightening as if gripped by an iron hand. And then, a chill rose within me, replacing the pain. I lifted my hand, let my finger glide across the screen, and pressed delete. The email vanished as though I had erased a piece of my wounded past. News from my family still reached me, though not through direct calls. A few relatives, the rare ones who still kept in touch, began telling me what was happening. Aunt Susan, who had always taken Rowan's side, called me once, her voice sharp with reproach. "Your parents cried at the family gathering last week," she said. "They told everyone you've turned heartless, that you're wealthy but ungrateful. Aren't you ashamed, Anthony?" I stayed silent because I knew nothing I said would matter. In their eyes, I was the traitor, the selfish one who turned his back on his family. They didn't know, or refused to know, how much I had sacrificed, how much I had carried, only to be repaid with scorn and betrayal. Rowan, as I expected, would not leave me in peace. Through whispers from relatives, I heard he was running around telling anyone who would listen that I was selfish, abandoning my own brother. He claimed I had kicked him out, that I was rich yet stingy, unwilling to share. I could picture his sneering smile, the way he would fold his arms, his voice dripping with resentment as he spoke about me. But I also heard Rowan was sinking deeper into trouble. Loan sharks, the same ones I had once partially paid off, were tightening their grip on him again. They called, threatened, even showed up at my parents' doorstep demanding more money. Once, according to Uncle Henry, a group of strangers banged on my parents' door at midnight, terrifying my mother so badly she had to call the police. I knew then it was the consequence Rowan had brought upon himself. He had chosen his path, and now he had to face what came of it. I sat in my grandfather's living room, gazing out at the stream glittering in the sunlight. I imagined my parents in that familiar house where I had grown up, now drowning in bills piled high on the table. I pictured my mother opening the mailbox, finding debt collection letters, and my father, his stern face strained, trying to appear calm but unable to hide his unease. Perhaps for the first time in their lives, they had to confront the reality of life without their living ATM named Anthony. A part of me ached. They were still my parents, no matter what they had done. But the larger, stronger part of me told me I had made the right choice. I could no longer live paying for the mistakes of others. At my grandfather's home, I began to feel a freedom I had never known. Each morning I woke to birdsong and the aroma of coffee he brewed in the kitchen. He never asked about my family, never forced me to explain, but his eyes always seemed to say, "You're on the right path." His villa with moss-covered stone walls and a crackling fireplace became my refuge, not just from the threats outside, but from the wounds within my heart. In the early days at my grandfather's house, I took time to rest and regain my balance. I didn't rush or push myself to dive back into work immediately. I knew after everything I'd been through, the slap from my father, Rowan's scornful smirk, the shattered glass on my porch, I needed time to heal. I often sat on the wooden bench in the garden, watching the shimmering stream flow over smooth stones, letting my mind drift with the water. Sometimes I'd sit there for hours, thinking of nothing, just listening to the silence. My grandfather didn't pry, but he was always there, a hot cup of coffee in hand, ready to listen if I wanted to talk. "Take your time, Anthony," he said once, noticing my distant gaze. "You don't have to run anymore. Here, you have time." But I knew I couldn't just stay still. I'd quit my job at the old firm, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't keep working while weighed down by the turmoil of my family. Every day there, I felt like I was carrying a shadow of myself, a tired Anthony dragged into responsibilities that weren't his. I needed a new path, one I could proudly call my own. One evening, as my grandfather and I sat by the fireplace, its flickering flames casting light on his weathered face, I shared my idea. "I want to work online, Grandpa," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I can take on remote architectural design projects, and I want to build my own company, something that's mine, independent of anyone else." My grandfather nodded, a glint of approval in his eyes, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Good," he said, his voice low but encouraging. "You have talent, Anthony. You've stood up on your own time and again, haven't you? This time won't be any different." His words were simple, but they fanned the flame of resolve within me. I felt a surge of new energy, a feeling I'd lost long ago, belief in myself. I took action the next day. I pulled out my laptop, sat at the oak table in my grandfather's living room, and reached out to a few old clients, those who'd been satisfied with my designs. I sent emails introducing my remote architectural design services, emphasizing my flexibility and unwavering quality. A few responded immediately, entrusting me with small projects, an interior design for a modest apartment, a renovation plan for a downtown cafe. These projects weren't grand, but they were a start. Each completed draft, each thank you email from a client felt like a small brick laying the foundation for my future. My grandfather, with his wisdom and network, quietly helped me. One morning, as I was sketching a design, he walked in and placed a piece of paper in front of me. "This is Frank Dawson's number," he said. "He's an old friend, and he needs an architect for a new housing development in the suburbs. Call him?" I was surprised, but didn't ask questions. I called Mr. Dawson, and after a brief conversation, he agreed to meet me. It turned out my grandfather didn't just connect me with Dawson. He'd also introduced me to others in the real estate world, people needing designs for homes, offices, even a small commercial building. "You're Harrison's grandson, right?" one client asked at our first meeting. He said, "You're very reliable." I smiled, my heart swelling with gratitude. My grandfather hadn't just given me a refuge, he'd opened a new door. Each day I felt myself stepping onto a new path. I worked hard, but the weight I'd once carried was gone. I drafted designs during the day, corresponded with clients in the evening, and sometimes sat with my grandfather, sharing new ideas. He listened, occasionally offering advice, but often just nodding as if encouraging me to find my own way. I began building a reputation step by step. One client recommended me to another, then another. Slowly, my project list grew, and I started dreaming of my own company. Not just a fantasy, but a real plan. I still remember one afternoon when I finished my first design for Mr. Dawson. I sent it via email, and just hours later he called back, his voice brimming with excitement. "You did a great job, Anthony. I want to work with you long term." I hung up, leaned back in my chair, and felt like I'd conquered a small mountain. For the first time in years, I was building something not for anyone else, but for myself. No more judgmental looks from my parents. No more sarcastic remarks from Rowan. No more sleepless nights fearing a ringing phone. I was living, truly living, on my own path. This beginning was small, but I knew it was a solid foundation. Every design, every client call, every word of praise was a brick in the new chapter of my life. I was no longer the exploited brother or the trampled son. I was Anthony Bennett, an architect, a man writing his own story. And here in my grandfather's peaceful villa, I found not just a home, but a future, where I was the master of my own life. The days living with my grandfather were a time when I learned to breathe again, to find joy in the simple things. The babbling of the stream in the garden, the aroma of the coffee he brewed each morning, and the hours spent by the fireplace, sketching new designs. I began rebuilding my life, step by step, project by project, with the belief that I could create a future unbound by the past. But I knew my family, especially my parents, wouldn't let me go so easily. I had braced myself for it, but when that day came, it still forced me to confront emotions I thought I'd buried. One late afternoon, as the sunset bathed my grandfather's garden in gold, I was sitting at the oak table checking an email from a client. A loud, urgent knock at the door startled me. My grandfather, reading by the fireplace, looked up, his eyes sharp but calm. "I'll get it," he said, setting his book down. But I stood, a chill running down my spine. "No, I'll do it, Grandpa." I knew, even without seeing who it was, that this moment was inevitable. When I opened the door, my parents stood there, their faces drawn under the faint glow of the porch light. My mother wore the green sweater I'd once bought her, but her eyes no longer held the warmth they once did. My father stood beside her, lips pressed tight, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets as if restraining something. "Anthony," my mother said, her voice soft but trembling. "We need to talk." I stood still, gripping the doorknob like it was my last anchor. I nodded silently and invited them in. We sat in my grandfather's living room, where the firelight danced on the moss-covered stone walls. My grandfather took his usual armchair, silent but present, his steady presence like a mountain. My parents sat across from me on the sofa, the air heavy with the weight of an impending storm. My mother spoke first, her voice gentle as if trying to soothe. "Anthony, you can't just abandon your family like this. You sold your house, cut off all the money you were sending, and moved here to live with your grandfather. What were you thinking? We're your parents. Rowan's your brother. Don't you see how much you're hurting us all? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom, I've done everything I could. I paid off Rowan's debt. I sent money for years, but I never got a single thank you. I just want to live my own life, not fix someone else's mistakes. My mother looked at me, her eyes welling up, but I saw not just sadness, but blame in them. How can you say that? She said, her voice rising. You're his brother. You're supposed to help him. My father, who had been silent until now, spoke, his voice icy. You think you're better than this family, don't you, Anthony? You think you can turn your back on your parents, your brother, just because you have a few filthy dollars? His words hit like a punch, leaving me speechless. Filthy dollars? I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. You call my hard work, the days I worked myself to exhaustion, filthy dollars? Have you ever asked how hard I've tried? The room grew stifling. My mother began to cry, her soft sobs echoing in the silence. You don't understand, Anthony, she said, her voice breaking. Rowan's still being threatened by those debt collectors. They come to our house, they bang on the door at night, they call. If you don't help, who knows what they'll do to us? Do you want us to live in fear? My heart ached, but not from sorrow. It was the bitter realization that they hadn't come here for me, but because they needed me to keep cleaning up Rowan's mess. I was about to respond when my grandfather, silent until now, spoke. His voice was low, but each word seemed carved into the air. Enough, he said, his gaze sweeping over my parents. You came here to blame Anthony, but have you ever looked at yourselves? How did you raise Rowan? You spoiled him, covered up his every mistake, and let him become an irresponsible man. And now, when he's brought trouble on himself, you blame Anthony, the one who sacrificed his entire life to keep this family from falling apart. My father turned to my grandfather, his face flushed with anger. Dad, this is our family's business. Stay out of it. But my grandfather didn't back down. He stood, his tall frame seeming to dominate the room. This is my family too, he said, his voice resolute. And I won't sit quietly while you trample Anthony any further. This boy has done more than you deserve. You favored Rowan, neglected Anthony, and now you demand he sacrifice his entire life to save someone who'll never change. Have you ever considered where you went wrong? My mother stopped crying, staring at my grandfather, her mouth open but speechless. My father clenched his fists, but my grandfather's gaze was an unyielding wall, allowing no resistance. He continued, Anthony has sacrificed for years, but you've never acknowledged his efforts. You only see Rowan, only see what you want to see. If you don't change, you'll lose both your sons, not just Anthony. My grandfather's words were like a cold wind silencing my parents. I sat there, my heart pounding, not from fear, but from a strange sensation. For the first time, someone had stood up for me. I looked at my grandfather, my heart swelling with gratitude. He hadn't just given me a refuge, he'd given me the strength to hold my ground. I took a deep breath and looked directly at my parents. I've done enough, I said, my voice steadier than ever. I'm not going back. I sold the house, I stopped the payments because I want to live for myself. Rowan has to take responsibility for what he's done, and if you can't accept that, I'm sorry, but I won't change. My father shot to his feet as if to say something, but my grandfather's gaze stopped him. My mother grabbed his arm, pulling him back down, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Anthony, is this really what you want? To cut ties with this family? I met her eyes, and for the first time I felt no guilt. I don't want to cut ties, I said, but I can't keep living to atone for Rowan's mistakes. I need my own life. The confrontation ended in silence. My parents left without another word. As the door closed, I felt an emptiness in my heart, but it was quickly replaced by relief. My grandfather placed a hand on my shoulder, saying nothing, but his gentle grip was enough. I knew I'd made the right choice. But my story is not just a personal journey. It is a lesson, a reminder I want to share with those struggling between family ties and self-respect. between duty and freedom. Looking back on my journey, I realized the invisible wounds that once shaped me. I grew up in a family where love came with conditions. I worked tirelessly, sent money to my parents, paid off Rowan's debts, all in the hope that one day they would acknowledge me. But all I received were accusations, a slap, and threatening words scrawled on my wall. I once thought sacrifice was the path to love, but I was wrong. Family should not be a burden. One of the greatest lessons I've learned is the importance of setting boundaries. For years, I lived without them, letting my parents and Rowan invade my life, taking what I'd built without a word of thanks. I thought doing so was filial piety, the duty of a son and brother. But I was mistaken. Not having boundaries didn't just exhaust me. It made me lose myself. When I decided to sell the house, cancel the automatic payments, and refuse to let Rowan move in, I wasn't just protecting my possessions. I was protecting my self-respect. I learned that sometimes saying no is the only way to say yes to yourself. The second lesson was about forgiveness, not for others, but for myself. I also learned that forgiveness is about freeing yourself. I forgave my parents and Rowan not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry resentment. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to endure more. It means letting go to move forward. Another painful lesson was that not every relationship is worth keeping. Family doesn't always mean love. When I walked away from my parents and Rowan, I felt like I was losing a part of myself. But I realized that sometimes you must let go of those who drag you down to rise up. My grandfather taught me that my worth doesn't lie in a house or money, but in how I face life. You are the one who creates your value, he said, and I carry those words like a compass. I'm rebuilding my life, one design, one small project at a time, with the belief that I can create my own future. My advice to those trapped in others' expectations: listen to your inner voice. Don't be afraid to set boundaries. Don't hesitate to say no. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to prove your worth. Choose to live for yourself, because that's the only way to be truly free. I'm still walking this new path beside my grandfather in his peaceful villa. There are tough days when the echoes of my family's accusations still linger, but I no longer let them pull me down. I am Anthony Bennett, and I'm rewriting my story, a story of self-respect, resilience, and freedom. 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 And freedom.